The prairie stretched endless and empty, but the silence was heavy. Not the peace of dawn, but the stillness before something breaks. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon and the restless cattle, danger was already moving, and by sundown, someone's blood would darken the dust. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. The first thing he felt was the air. It lay across him like an extra blanket, not in warmth, but in weight. Heavy, still, the kind of stillness that carried its own sound, a muffled hum that wasn't truly sound at all, but the absence of it. This wasn't the quiet of a peaceful dawn. This was the kind of quiet that made animals freeze, that made a man's instincts stir in his chest. His eyes opened slowly. The world above was still marked by stars, scattered thin against a black sky that had begun to pale at the edges. A waning moon hung low over the western mesas, its light fragile, like it could be blown out by a strong enough wind. He didn't move right away. Lying still, he let the world speak to him, or in this case, refuse to speak. Normally, this hour between night and day brought its own rhythm. A lowing from the herd, the steady grind of cattle shifting hooves in frosted grass, the sigh of wind pushing over the open plains. Even the quiet was never this quiet. Today, it was absolute. The fire beside him was dead, reduced to blackened wood and faint ash that smelled faintly of smoke when he inhaled. The canvas of his bedroll was damp with dew, cold against his back. He sat up, slow enough not to break whatever spell the land seemed to be under. His mare was where he'd left her the night before, 10 paces away, tethered to the short post hammered into the ground. But she wasn't resting. Her head was low, eyes fixed toward the east, ears pricking forward and swiveling in small, calculated movements. Her stance was still, but her muscles told a different story, tight, ready to spring. He didn't like that. Pulling on his coat, he felt the familiar stiffness of worn leather, its creases shaped by years of sun, sweat, and rain. The brim of his hat was curled and uneven, but it sat on his head like it had been grown there. His boots crunched faintly against the frost-hardened ground as he rose. Ahead, the prairie stretched on without end, a sea of grass with shadows pooled in the low folds of the land. The horizon glowed faintly, the first hints of gold and gray pressing upward from where the sun would soon climb. In the far distance, the mesas stood black and sharp against the dimming stars, ancient and unchanging. The herd was a dark, slow-moving mass beyond the camp. At least, it should have been moving. But they stood clustered unnaturally close, all facing the same direction, toward the east, toward that pale line of light. Normally, at this hour, they'd graze, shuffle, or wander within the loose shape of the herd. Now, they were statues in the half-light. A cold line worked its way down his spine. The land has its own language, and if you stayed in it long enough, you learned to read it without thinking. He crouched, brushing the grass aside with his glove. The frost nearest his camp was untouched, but a few yards out, it was disturbed. Blades were bent and broken, the earth pressed down into deep, clean imprints. Hoof prints, not his. They crossed his own from the night before, heading from the open plains toward the low hills northeast of camp. The edges were sharp, unblurred by wind. They'd been made recently, within the last few hours. Judging by the spacing and depth, the rider had been moving fast, the horse carrying weight. The mare gave a faint huff, nostrils flaring. The wind shifted, brushing against his cheek, carrying with it a scent that made his jaw tighten. Blood. It wasn't thick in the air, not enough to make it overwhelming, but the metallic tang was there, sharp and unmistakable. The kind of scent that stuck in the throat and didn't belong in the clean bite of morning frost. It came and went with the shifting wind, almost like a warning carried in whispers. He straightened and turned his gaze toward the northeast. The low hills there were still half swallowed in shadow, their ridges soft and uneven in the early light. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, just as the first sliver of sun broke the horizon, he saw it. A flash. It was quick, so quick, he could have convinced himself it was nothing. A flicker of light, like the sun bouncing off polished metal or glass. But instinct told him otherwise. The mare's ears were still locked forward. The herd had not shifted. He let his eyes drop back to the hoofprints. The trail was clear, cutting across the land like a wound. It didn't take much to picture what might be waiting at the other end. Out here, trouble rarely showed itself all at once. It bled and slow, until you were standing knee-deep in it without realizing. His body moved without hurry, but without waste. He tightened his coat, pulled the saddle blanket over the mare's back, then set the saddle down. The leather groaned as it settled into place. Every strap cinched tight, every stirrup checked, the motions were muscle memory, done 1,000 times over in the years behind him. The rifle came next, drawn from its oilskin wrap, checked with a glance, then slid into the scabbard at the saddle horn. Out here, riding without a rifle was an invitation for the land to take whatever it wanted from you. The mare shifted under his weight as he swung into the saddle. She didn't need urging. She stepped forward the moment he settled, ears still pointed to the horizon. The sound of her hooves on frozen ground was sharp, the rhythm steady. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the grass, but the light didn't bring warmth. If anything, it sharpened the edges of the world, the shapes of the hills, the curve of the hoofprints, the black scatter of crows beginning to circle somewhere in the distance. Crows never gathered without a reason. He kept his eyes forward, following the trail. The ground dipped and rose in subtle folds, enough to hide movement if you weren't looking for it. His mare's breath steamed in the cold air. As they closed in on the first rise of the hills, he could smell it again. Blood, stronger now, mingled with the damp, trampled scent of disturbed grass. The tracks deepened, the horse ahead slowing before vanishing behind the ridge. He reined in just before the slope, letting the mare stand still. He listened. Nothing moved in the grass around them. No wind in the mesquite. No call from the birds circling above. The quiet was still wrong. And now it was about to tell him why. The light came slow, peeling back the dark one thin layer at a time. The prairie did not rush to greet it. Frost held to the blades like a stubborn memory, and the ground kept its stiffness, as if the night hadn't yet consented to end. He rode the line where shadow met day, following the deep-cut spoor that crossed his own and pressed toward the low swell of the hills. The trail read like a confession written in the dirt. Long strides, the spacing even at first, then stretched by urgency, then shortened by caution. The rider had pushed through the open plain, then, sensing a reason to slow, tightened the reins as the land began to fold. Weight sat heavy in each. Impression. A body, a burden, or a conscience. It made no difference to the ground. It recorded only pressure and direction. Crows began to stitch the sky into a circle above the far rise, their bodies black against the easing gray. They did not speak in the language of song. They simply existed where life had turned toward stillness, and their orbit narrowed with every heartbeat. He marked their pattern, not because he needed the omen, but because the air already carried the metallic edge of certainty. The mare moved with a patience that came from long miles and earned trust. Muscle pulled clean beneath her hide, breath plumed in the brittle morning and vanished. Her ears tracked the horizon, then tilted back a fraction, reading the slow tilt of his weight, the way his hands eased her forward and held her back. The two of them made a single shape against the land, deliberate, quiet, and listening. The herd far behind held its strange formation, faces lifted one way, bodies unwilling to break the spell. Between them and the hills lay a run of grass torn in strips and laid flat by the hooves he followed. In the torn seams, he found more signs: a scrap of horsehair snagged on a mesquite thorn, a scuff where a boot had dragged while shifting in the saddle, the faint crescent of a slip where the front right hoof had skidded and recovered. No waste in the movement. Whoever rode had experience and something to protect. He halted where the frost thinned and the ground turned damp under the first real touch of sun. He swung down and let the reins fall loose, trusting the mare to stand. The soil here had taken more than a horse's weight. On the edge of a shallow swale, a print lay smudged but readable, the heel of a man's boot, angled and set beside the hoof. The rider had dismounted, just for a breath, then climbed back up. The heel told him more than direction. It told him caution had deepened into fear. In the swale, dew had gathered in tiny spheres that caught the light like a scatter of glass beads. Threaded through them was a darker stain that the sun had not yet thinned.
Not much, not a pool.
A fine spray at the edge of crushed grass where a body had jolted wrong or a wound had whispered open. He dipped a gloved finger to confirm what his nose had already decided. The iron taste rose behind his tongue and settled there, certain and unkind. The wind ran a hand over the grass and left it as it found it. Far off, the mesas cut a severe line under the whitening sky, and closer, the hills hunched like folded knuckles. Somewhere just beyond the crest, the crows corkscrewed tighter, and their shadow poured a slow swirl across the slope. He wiped his glove clean on the cuff and set it back on the reins. He did not hurry. Hurrying in the mouth of the hills was how men's names vanished from other men's lips. He mounted, felt the mare's ribs lift into his calves, and let her walk the last stretch, hooves finding the quieter patches of earth where the sound would carry less. At the base of the rise, he reined in and listened. Sound stacked in thin layers, the faint conversation of leather, the heartbeat he could feel through the saddle tree, the distant grit murmur of something small moving where the sun had woken insects from their numbness. No voices, no clatter, only the low patience of the land and the crow's moving circle. He leaned forward and let the mare pick a zigzag path among the rocks. Each step raised a question, and each answer came back the same. Proceed, but keep a debt's eye on the cost. He crested not at the obvious notch, but a half length to the side where scrub offered a screen. There he held, and there the signs changed from reading to sight. Below the ridge, the hill scooped into a shallow basin, a bowl of bleached grass and 3 scattered junipers. Near the basin's middle, the earth had been dismissed of its frost and flattened by struggle. The prints were a tangle, horse and boot, a knee, a scuff like someone had taken the ground to their ribs and shoved against it to stand. On the far margin, something glinted again, less a flash now than a steady, sun-bit shine. He studied the basin's rims before he let his eyes drop to the shine. No movement on the left shoulder. No movement to the right. The crows drifted lower, but their wings did not stutter the air in any nervous way. Whatever had happened here had largely finished itself. He eased the mare forward by inches and kept her head tied to the slope rather than the bowl's center. Her ears flicked once, then settled. He let her shadow fall short of the glinting object before he swung down again. The thing that caught the light was small, a buckle tongue broken from its frame, half buried where a heel had ground it into the dirt. Near it, the torn leather of a strap lay like a shed snakeskin, its edges rasped by a blade. He lifted the strap, turned it in his hand, and fit it to a picture he wouldn't quite allow to form. A cinch lost under strain, or a hasty cut to free a body from a saddle whose weight had become a danger. A tuft of the mare's earlier patience moved behind him. He returned to her side, slid the buckled tongue into a pocket, and traced the trail where it left the basin. The hoofprints he'd followed in emptied into this place. The hoofprints that left it were fewer, their spacing uneven, as if the horse had taken to favoring one leg. Beside them, boot prints doubled for a time, then split away, then returned. Whoever had ridden had dismounted here, walked a stretch to ease a horse or to gather something spilled, then climbed back aboard to stagger the climb out. It would have been enough to turn him back to the herd on a different morning. A lame mount ahead meant time, and time meant he could steer his charges west and be rid of whatever lay untidily in his path. But the air still tasted of iron, and the crows still wrote their backward script above the next lower ridge. He had not yet reached the place the wind had warned of before dawn. He climbed back into the saddle and kept to the basin's rim as he skirted east. He let the distance between them and the center widen until the prints widened, resolved again in clean lines that ran toward a notch in the hill. Through that notch, the world beyond took on a new color, not the cold brass of early sun, but a tan-gray haze that rose and stalled, as if the land itself were holding grit in its lungs. Dust hung and waging, the kind that did not come from wind alone. The notch narrowed into a throat of pale rock, its floor set with stones that spoke sharply when iron shoes met their edges. He slowed the mare until her steps became careful thoughts. In the throat's shade, the air cooled again. The smell of blood thinned, and the dust smell took its place, dry and flat and recent. The throat opened on a small shelf, and from that shelf the land fell away in a crumbly incline to a long, shallow draw. There, the story laid itself out without courtesy. A second set of hoofprints joined the first from the west, cutting at an angle, meeting, and then running together for a stretch before becoming a stampede of indecision. The ground showed the wild grammar of panic, gouges where a horse had spun, crescents where hooves had skated sideways, a deep four-point clatter mark from a fallen animal whose knees and chest had hit together. In the middle of it all, the darker stains no longer shy of the sun. He did not ride straight in. He let the shelf give him vantage and stood in the stirrups to stretch the picture flat. One horse had come lame out of the basin and been met by another, fresher mount. The riders had threaded the draw together, then the world had narrowed to a tangle. How it had begun, he could not read. How it had ended was clearer. On the draw's lower lip, a skid ran long and ended at a jumble of stones where hair and hide had caught and torn. The hair belonged to a bay, the hide to the same. Small black flies already orbited, slow with morning cold, but certain of their work. A few paces beyond, an impression set deeply and long marked where a human body had lain. The print did not have the slackness of death. It had the determination of someone who had pressed their weight to the ground to find breath again. Beside that long print lay the other shine he had glimpsed from the plains, not steel, but glass. A small circle of cloudy lens, prisms cracked in a spider's bloom, wire bent out of its proper shape. He left it where it lay. He did not need it to tell him the truth that tugged at the corners, the truth that this was not only cattle country and outlaw country, but also the kind of country where men brought the finer edges of distant cities and lost them quickly. The mare shook her coat, the sound small and intimate in the large morning. He moved her along the shelf and let her rest in the lee of a boulder, while he slid down the slope on foot. The draw held more than prints and stains. It held fragments of compulsion, a snapped button from a coat, a scrap of paper like the husk of moth's wing, a short length of mercerized thread that had no business on this side of the world unless someone had carried it. He touched nothing. He needed only to place each in his mind's ledger: burden, haste, intersection, struggle, and now flight. The outbound tracks angled toward a stand of cottonwoods whose roots drank from a thin, reluctant trickle at the draw's bottom. The horse that led favored the right foreleg markedly now. The other moved clean. Between them, the boot prints left and returned again, broad, heel-worn, the gait longer than the average drifter's, and set down with a kind of economy that suggested habit rather than fear. Fear made people slap feet without pattern. Habit made even a hunted man count steps. He followed to the water and found the ground muddled by hooves as they had crossed and recrossed the streambed. On a small bar where the water pooled briefly, the earth held the clearest impression of all. Fingers pressed to the soil, spread, and set deep. A hand that had steadied itself, while the other perhaps reached for a throat, a rein, or a weapon never dropped. The hand's size fit the boot's stride. Long bones, long reach. Upstream, the water carried a thread of red and unspooled it into nothing. Downstream, a broken willow showed fresh white where a branch had been torn when someone had shouldered through. Beyond it, the track resolved again, and the story simplified into a single line. Two horses, one limping, moving east into thicker cover where the cottonwoods made a light green roof over the creek's bend. He looked once across his shoulder to where the shelf gave view of the open country. The herd lay far and dim now, the mass smaller under the late morning's rising brightness. He measured distance the way a working man does, with the weight of what depended on it, and found he could still angle back to the cattle by afternoon if he turned here. He measured the air again, then set the measure aside. The day had made a shape and asked him to fit to it. He did not like the request, but he understood it. He returned to the mare and swung up with the same caution he'd used to descend. The draw's sides rose to either hand, and the cottonwoods tightened their line ahead. He let the mare go on the bit and took the creek at a slow trot that wouldn't set stones to talking. Between trunks, the world narrowed to a corridor mottled with patches of sun. The prince rode this mottling like music, quiet in the shaded soils and louder where dry earth had dusted to the surface. Bird calls returned here, the small declarative statements of creatures that made no moral of the day, only arrangements. Over all of it lay the farther, fainter drone of the crows who had not quite abandoned their circles behind him. Death and distance had a different agreement than life did. He caught the first new sign where the trees broke briefly onto a gravel fan and the creek split around it. A mark cut the gravel at an angle no horse could make. A heel, the edge of it serrated with wear, had pivoted, then driven. The shape carried urgency. The man had dropped from his saddle here, either by choice or by force of his own decision. The hoof prints wavered without the rider's weight for a dozen steps, then settled. On the fan's far side, the boot prints separated from the horse's trail, a clean veer into brush that hugged the creek bank. The tracks deepened where the soil turned damp and rose again along a game path that clung to a low bluff. The separation clarified the earlier pattern. One man on foot and ahead, one still mounted, both moving in the same direction but with different reasons. The man on foot carried speed that surprised the eye after reading his measured gait. The mounted one kept to the water where hoof sound and hardpan left less to be read. He let the mare drink and lifted his eyes to the bluff line. The game path offered him the view he needed and the exposure he did not. He took it anyway, riding the lower edge and letting shrubs take his silhouette apart. The path rose until the creek lay below like a twist of bottle glass. In that glass, movement resolved, faint, brief, but as real as the smell of iron had been at dawn. Two shapes, distanced and staggered by trees. The rear shape rode and listed slightly with the uneven rhythm of a lame horse. The forward shape moved with the plain efficiency of a man who had run before and learned exactly how much to give the ground and how much to keep for the next mile. Between them, the creek bent out of sight and back again. Between them, the day lengthened. He breathed once, steady, and counted the beats between the two shapes by the way ripples from their passage touched the same stones at separate times. He leaned to the mare's neck and felt the coil in her shoulders, the readiness made of hunger and loyalty and training. He did not ask for speed yet. He did not ask for anything but patience. The bluff narrowed and forced him to choose: drop to the water and risk the noise of stones, or keep high and accept the exposure of open scrub. He chose a third way he had not seen until he'd given up on finding it, a shallow switchback of deer prints that tucked into the bluff's face and spit him out lower without advertisement. He took it, thanking nothing and everything, and came back to the water's edge in time to see the mounted shape vanish through a curtain of willow. The running man had left the creek and turned into a stand of cottonwoods whose trunks rose pale and tall, their bark furrowed in gray ladders. The ground there took prints as clean as wet clay takes the mark of a thumb. The stride had lengthened to a limit, met it, and maintained. The rider, narrowed by pain and the horse's favoring leg, followed that path, but left his own impatience in the way the limp turned into small staggers and recoveries. The corridor of trees drew tight and then ended at a wall of pale stone where the creek had once thrown itself hard enough to carve, then had reconsidered and wandered away. There, the running man's prints stopped clean at the rock and did not resume on the other side. The mounted man's trail slowed to a crawl, turned in a tight circle, and faced the same wall. He looked up at the rock and read the only sentence that made sense. The ledge above held a shallow shelf, just wide enough for a body that knew fear as a tutor. The shelf ran the length of the wall and emptied into brush above where a man could disappear if he kept his head low and his hands sure. The rider had discovered this late, perhaps too late, and the limp had written frustration into the dust. The ground bore no second circle, only a long pause, only a decision. He followed the pause with his eyes and saw where it resolved. On the wall's right-hand side, a darker seam split the stone into two uneven panels. At the seam's base, the dirt wore a new shape, fresh, rectangular, and pressed by a weight different from hooves and boots. A crate edge, perhaps, or a box that had been levered there by tired arms. Beside it, the faint suggestion of knuckles in the dust as someone had steadied the load and exhaled. He did not know yet what the crate had held. He did not know yet whether it had been left or taken on. He knew only that it had become part of the choice made at this wall. Ahead, the shelf ran into thicket and unknowns. Behind, the draw unpacked the morning's violence into crows and flies. Between, the creek spoke its simple language to stones. He let the mare stand and listened again, not for sound this time, but for the particular pressure in the air that the day had kept since dawn. It had not eased. If anything, it had found a narrower channel, and through that channel it pressed. The sign on the rock shoulder confirmed the press. a smear of the same iron color tucked under a ledge where a hand would go when hauling a body upward. It was not a gush, it was a signature. Small, personal, certain. He put his palm to the stone to know its temperature. Warm where the sun had found it, cool where the shelf shaded it, rough enough to anchor skin. He took his hand away and set it on the mare's neck, and she turned an ear back to him, as if to say the thing they could not say to each other. The day had chosen its path, and if he followed, he would be reading not only the land, but also the inside of a man's need. He checked the rifle without looking at it, and drew a breath that tasted of willow and dust and the faintest residue of blood left in the morning. Then he guided the mare toward the seam in the rock where the crate print lay, where the shelf began, and where the horizon, at last, would stop offering signs and start offering answers that would require a reckoning. The sun was awake now, though it had not yet claimed the whole land. It hung low and patient, bleeding its gold across the tops of the mesas and spilling into the folds of the plains in long, slow rivers of light. But in the valleys, the cold still clung like an animal unwilling to leave its den. He had ridden back from the rock seam, not to retreat, but to take stock of the land, of the herd in the distance, and of the space between the two. From this vantage, the horizon was a story written in light and shadow. The eastern sky was a wash of pale blue, the west still holding on to the bruised purple of night. Every hill, every ridge, every scatter of rock stood sharper now, their shapes cast long by the morning. The herd, far behind, was restless in its stillness. Even at a distance, he could see how they kept their bodies tight together, as if they were trying to make themselves smaller, less noticeable. Their heads were high, ears turning in small, deliberate movements, reading the same language he had read since dawn. The air had changed. The earth had shifted. Something was out there. He slid down from the saddle, boots meeting the thawing soil with a damp, heavy sound. The mare dropped her head to snatch at the frostbitten grass, but her ears stayed turned forward, toward the low hills. She wasn't relaxed, she was conserving. She was keeping her energy for something she didn't yet understand, but could feel pressing in from the edges of the world. He set to his work without hurry, but without wasting motion. Every task was more than habit. It was an answer to the question the land had been asking since he woke. First came the saddle blanket, smoothed flat across her back so no fold or wrinkle would bite into her skin during the miles ahead. Then the saddle itself, its weight settling into place with the familiar groan of worn leather. He checked the cinch twice, not because it needed it, but because some things weren't worth leaving to chance. The stirrups were set just so, not too long to slow his seat, not too short to tire his knees before the day demanded more of them. Next was the rifle. He pulled it from its oilskin wrap, the smell of the oiled metal sharp in the cool air. He didn't need to work the action. He'd cleaned it last night until it was as ready as it would ever be. It slid into the scabbard beside the saddle horn, easy to reach, hard to lose. He adjusted the strap on his saddlebags, feeling the weight inside shift. There was food enough for a day, water enough for half if things went wrong, and a coil of rope that had seen more uses than it had been made for. The wind brushed past him, softer than before, but still with that faint trace, the metallic tang that didn't belong in morning air. It wasn't strong now. It was more memory than presence. But he didn't forget it. Blood never belonged in the scent of dawn unless something had gone wrong. When everything was set, he stood still for a moment beside the mare. The land was wide open around him, but in that moment it felt smaller, like the edges had drawn in. He thought about the trail leading toward the hills, how clean it had been, how deliberate. Whoever left it hadn't been wandering. They'd been moving towards something. The mare shifted under the saddle, a slow tightening of muscle that traveled from her shoulders to her flanks.
She was ready now. The kind of ready that wasn't about speed, but about direction.
She was waiting for his choice.
He put his foot in the stirrup and swung into the saddle, the leather flexing under his weight. The sun's light touched his face, but the warmth didn't reach him. His eyes were fixed on the low hills ahead, where the shadows pooled thick and unbroken.
The herd was safe for now.
The plains were quiet. But the trail ahead wasn't going to stay fresh forever. With a small nudge of his heel, the mare began to move.
The mare's hooves struck the earth in a rhythm that felt steady but not relaxed. Each step was placed with care, as if she too knew that every sound here carried farther than it should.
The morning had warmed just enough to loosen the frost, turning patches of ground into dark, damp earth that pulled at her shoes with a soft, sucking sound.
The open plains had been behind them for less than a mile, yet the world already felt different.
Here, the wind didn't move the same way.
It came in short breaths, sliding between the folds of the land and disappearing before it could stretch its legs. The air was heavier, holding on to scents longer. The clean smell of grass was still there, but beneath it lingered others. Damp earth, stale water, the faint ghost of smoke from somewhere far off, and that metallic note that had been chasing him since before dawn. The hills ahead rose like sleeping beasts, their spines marked by rock and brush. The sunlight reached for them, but they kept their shadows tight around their flanks, letting only thin ribbons of gold touch their edges. Those shadows were deep, the kind that hid movement well. The trail curved between two low ridges, the kind of fold in the land that was useful for a man wanting to pass unseen. The hoofprints he followed didn't wander. They stayed disciplined, hugging the inside of the curve, avoiding the high ground where a careless shadow might betray the rider. That told him enough to know this wasn't the work of someone lost. The mare's ears stayed forward, her muscles firm under the saddle. Every so often, her head would tilt just slightly, nostrils flaring, reading something on the air that he couldn't yet see. She wasn't nervous, not in the skittish way a green horse might be, but she was tuned to the land, alert in a way that told him he wasn't imagining the tension. He noticed it too, small shifts at the edges of sight. A movement in the brush that stopped when he turned his head. A flicker along the ridgeline that might have been nothing but light changing, yet didn't feel like nothing. The human eye could be fooled, but instincts, they didn't make things up. The path steepened slightly, leading toward a saddle-shaped ridge that overlooked the valley beyond. The hoofprints grew shallower here. The horse ahead had slowed, not because of fatigue, but because the rider had known what lay ahead. You didn't rush into valleys like the one waiting beyond that ridge. When they reached the crest, he reined the mare in and let her stand. The view below was a narrow corridor of land, darker than it should have been for this time of morning. Cottonwoods lined the valley floor, their leaves whispering against each other, the sound carrying in soft bursts. The wind here seemed to turn back on itself, trapped between the slopes. And there, in the dim light under the trees, something moved. It was small, quick, almost shy in the way it appeared, and vanished again. It could have been an animal. It could have been something else. Either way, it meant the valley wasn't empty. The hoofprints led straight into it. No hesitation, no attempt to circle around. Whoever had come before him had gone into the shadows willingly. That alone told him two things. They had a reason to be there, and they weren't afraid of what might be inside. He shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking under his weight, and adjusted his grip on the reins. His other hand rested lightly against the stock of the rifle, not drawing it yet, but ready for the need. The valley ahead was the kind of place where light and sound went to die,
and where a man could vanish without a trace. He nudged the mare forward. Together, they stepped into the shadow. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to burn the shadows from the ridgetops, the world had changed. The cool bite of morning was gone, replaced by a steady, pressing heat that seemed to rise not only from above, but from the earth itself. The air shimmered faintly over the open stretches, bending the horizon until it seemed uncertain where the land ended and the sky began. The trail led them out of the valley's shade and onto an open stretch of broken ground. Here, the grass was shorter, the soil drier, and the wind carried more grit than breath. Every step of the mare's hooves kicked up a faint halo of dust that clung to her legs and his boots before falling back to the earth. The hoof prints ahead were harder to read now. The soil didn't take impressions as kindly as the damp ground near the creek. But they were still there, scuffs in the dust, the faint arc of a shoe, a displaced stone that had rolled and settled. Even in bad ground, a rider in a hurry always left more than they meant to. The sun worked against him. It sat high and merciless, painting the land in hard, unforgiving light. Every rise and ridge threw down sharp shadows, and every shadow felt like it could be hiding something. Out here, you learned to keep your eyes not only on what was lit, but on what wasn't. The mare's breathing grew heavier, the sound muffled under the hiss of the wind dragging over the dry grass. He eased her pace, not because the trail was cold, but because pushing her too hard now would mean having nothing left if the day turned quickly. And days like this had a way of turning quickly. Every so often, the wind would shift just enough to carry scents from far ahead. Most of it was dust, the kind that stuck in the throat and made the tongue feel like leather. But under it, there were other traces. Faint, nearly lost, but still there. Horse sweat, leather warmed under the sun, and once, so briefly he almost doubted it, that same metallic edge that had first woken him in the dark. The land began to rise again, not steep, but steady. The heat pressed harder here, the air stiller. It was the kind of ground that burned the soles of a man's feet if he stayed in one place too long, the kind of heat that made tempers short and mistakes easy. Ahead, a line of mesquite trees broke the horizon, their twisted branches offering a promise of shade that was more illusion than fact. The hoofprints angled toward them, and he followed, letting the mare keep a straight, deliberate gait. When they reached the trees, the shade was thin, more shadow than coolness, but it gave the mare a moment's relief. He swung down, letting her drink from his canteen in small pulls, the water darkening. The dust around her muzzle. He took a sip himself, feeling it settle in his chest like something earned rather than given. The ground beneath the mesquite was churned, not by cattle, but by horses. More than one. The prints overlapped, confused in places, but he could still read enough to see that the rider he'd been following had met others here. There was no sign of a fight, no sudden bursts of scattering prints, no deep gouges where a horse had gone over, but there was something else. The dust here was marked by the drag of something heavy. Not a body, too consistent for that. More like the edge of a crate, a trunk, or something long wrapped in canvas. Whatever it was, they'd loaded it onto one of the horses before leaving. The outbound tracks were deeper, weighted down. They'd turned east. He noted the angle, the sun's position, the lay of the land ahead. East meant the ground would get flatter for a time before it rose again toward the Badlands. Flatter ground could mean speed, or a trap laid in the open where there was nowhere to turn. He capped the canteen, swung back into the saddle, and let the mare step out from under the mesquite's shadow. The heat met him again like a wall. The dust swirled around them with every step. Somewhere ahead, the trail was getting warmer in ways that had nothing to do with the sun. The mesquite grove thinned behind him, and the land stretched open again, flat, pale, and endless. A place where a man could be seen from miles away if someone knew where to look. The air shimmered in the distance, heat bending the line between ground and sky, turning shapes into mirages. It wasn't just the heat he noticed now. The wind had changed. It was still there, sliding over the plain, but its voice had shifted from the constant hiss of dust to something softer, uneven, a kind of broken rhythm. It carried smells the way only open country could. Dry earth, distant sage, the faint tang of horse sweat, and something else. Not the metallic edge of blood this time, but the sharper scent of smoke. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. Out here, no one burned for pleasure in the middle of the day. Smoke in daylight was either a necessity or a signal. He eased the mare's pace, letting her walk so her hooves made less sound against the hardpan. The sun was at his back now, stretching his shadow long ahead of him. It made him uneasy. A man's shadow in open country could be a warning to someone waiting over the next rise. The trail in the dust was changing too. The hoofprints he'd been following had lost their clean, disciplined edges. They wavered slightly, the gait uneven. It could have been the weight they were carrying, or the heat, or both. But it told him something important. They were slowing. A hawk drifted overhead, riding the thermals. Its shadow passed over the mare's flank, and she twitched, ears flicking back before locking forward again. She'd caught something he hadn't yet, a movement, faint and far to the north. He looked without turning his head fully, scanning with the corners of his eyes. There, just at the edge of the heat shimmer, a darker shape against the horizon. It was low, moving steady, not quite in line with the trail ahead, but close enough to matter. Another rider. Too far to see clearly, but close enough that he didn't believe in coincidence anymore. He'd been following the trail since before the sun was up. Now maybe someone was following him. The wind shifted again, and for the briefest moment, he caught something almost like a voice. Not words, but the echo of movement. A horse's breath on the air, distant but carried forward in pieces. He stayed in the saddle, but lowered his posture slightly, keeping his outline broken against the uneven folds of the land. He kept the mare to a steady walk, knowing that speed now would only draw more eyes. The trail ahead sloped gently downward into a shallow basin, ringed by low rises. It was the kind of place that could hide a rider until the last moment, or bury a man in trouble he couldn't ride out of. The hoofprints ahead led straight into it. He stopped at the edge, letting the mare stand while he listened. The wind slid over the basin like it was skimming glass, carrying the faint rattle of brush somewhere far below. No bird song, no insect hum. Just the empty breathing of the land. Whatever waited in that basin, it wasn't alone. And neither was he anymore. The basin lay quiet beneath the sun, a shallow bowl of pale earth ringed with ridges that rose just high enough to hide what waited beyond. From where he sat, the land inside looked bare, stripped of anything tall enough to cast real shade. Only a few clusters of brittle grass broke the monotony, their tips trembling under the slow drag of the wind. He let the mare stand a moment longer, her breathing steady, her ears flicking forward and back in measured rhythm. She was reading the ground, same as he was, not with her eyes, but through the tension in her body, the scent in her nostrils, and the faint vibrations that reached her through her hooves. From the ridge, he could see the tracks laid bare in the open earth below. The trail he had been following entered the basin from the west, crossing directly toward the far side without breaking pace. The prints were deep here, pressed into fine, pale dust that held their shape like a mold. That dust told more than just direction. It told the story of weight and wear. The lead horse was struggling now. The front prints dug harder into the earth, as if the animal was leaning into its own movement to keep from faltering. The rear prints dragged ever so slightly, toes scuffing the dust before lifting, a subtle, constant stumble. Whatever burden it carried was working against both horse and rider. Beside those hoof prints, in places where the ground allowed, the long oval of boot soles appeared. The rider had dismounted for short stretches, walking alongside the horse, leaving shallow, hurried steps that matched the animal's pace. In the softer patches, the dust showed the faint smudge of a rope trailing between them, occasionally lifted clear before touching down again. But that wasn't all. Another set of tracks had entered the basin from the north, fresher, lighter, and moving fast. The hoofprints here were clean, the gait even, the animal unburdened. These tracks cut a wide arc, curving inward toward the main trail like a hawk tightening its circle on prey. He studied the pattern. The north rider hadn't caught up yet, but they were closing. They were keeping distance, letting the first trail lead them, and, by extension, him, deeper into the basin. It wasn't pursuit in a straight line. It was herding. The wind carried the faintest hiss as dust slid down one of the slopes, a sound too small for the mare to spook at, but sharp enough for him to notice. Something had moved up there, unseen beyond the rim. The basin's center was flat, exposed. Anyone crossing it would be visible from the ridges above. The kind of ground where you could be watched from every side without ever knowing where the eyes were. He eased the mare forward, down the slope in a slow, quiet descent. Each step sent up a puff of dust that hung briefly before settling back to the earth. The air down here was heavier, the heat pressed close, and the silence felt denser than it had above. The tracks ahead were as clear as ink on paper. The first rider had left the basin by the far side, climbing toward a gap between two ridges. The second trail, the one from the north, had shifted, hugging the inside of the basin's curve, shadowing the other's path but never crossing it. It was a dance, one leading, one closing in. And now he had to decide whether to keep following the same steps, or break the pattern before it closed around him. The wind shifted again, just enough to carry the faint rattle of wings. It was the kind of sound a man didn't need to see to recognize. The dry, leathery beat of birds built for patience, for waiting on things to end. Vultures! They were high at first, just shadows drifting in the heat-shimmered sky. But the way they moved told the truth. They weren't riding the thermals for the sake of the air. They were circling something below, their slow, deliberate arcs tightening with every turn. He reined in the mare, letting her stand still in the open basin. Her head lifted, nostrils twitching. She caught it before he did, the scent. Fainter than the smoke from before, heavier than the trace of blood on the wind at dawn. The air down here was thicker, holding on to it, not letting it go. The hoof prints he'd been following were still clear, climbing toward the gap in the ridge. The second set, the one that had curved in from the north, had shifted closer now, pressing almost parallel to the first. Both trails led toward the same place, the base of the gap where the vultures circled overhead. He eased the mare forward. Each step sent a dull puff of dust into the air, the heat pressing down harder the closer they came. The ground underfoot was churned here, not in the wild scatter of a fight, but in the restless milling of horses waiting, turning in tight circles, stamping as their riders watched something they didn't want to touch just yet. The vultures hung low now, their shadows sliding across the pale ground like black sails. And then he saw what had drawn them. It lay just off the trail, half hidden in the scrub at the base of the ridge. A shape that had once been a horse, now still and sunken into itself. The hide was torn along the flank, dark with what had dried there, the wound ragged as if made by something desperate or cruel. The flies were there already, thick in the air above it, their sound a dull, constant hum. Near its head, the ground bore the print of knees pressed deep, the earth darkened in patches that hadn't yet faded to brown. Whoever had been with this horse had been here long enough to kneel, maybe to drink, maybe to take something from the saddlebags before leaving the rest behind. The hoofprints picked up again beyond the carcass, one set still steady, the other dragging now, the limp in the lead horse worse than before. The vultures didn't care for the details. They only cared for what stayed still long enough to give itself over to them. He let his eyes travel up the ridgeline. The gap above was narrow, the rock faces steep on either side. In the open air, it looked like just another cut in the land, but he'd been in country like this before. A man could set himself on either side of that opening and see everything coming long before it arrived. The second set of tracks told him enough. Someone was still up there, and they hadn't bothered to hide their presence because they didn't think they needed to. The mare shifted under him, impatient, her ears flicking toward the gap. He gave her a light pull on the reins, slowing her. This wasn't a place to ride straight through without thought. The vultures wheeled again, their shadows stretching over him as they turned. He knew better than to ignore them. Things that drew birds also drew men. And sometimes the men were worse. The gap ahead sat like a mouth in the ridge, narrow and silent, its shadows stretching across the pale ground in a long, uneven stripe. From the basin floor, it looked passable enough. Just a natural cut in the land, but he knew better than to trust the easy read of distance. Passes like this were never only what they seemed. The mare's ears stayed locked forward, every step deliberate as she closed the space between them and the gap. The ground rose steadily now, the dust under her hooves giving way to harder soil mixed with loose stone. Each shift of her weight sent small pebbles skittering down the slope, their sound carrying farther than he liked. The trail was still there, written plainly for anyone with eyes to read. The lead horse was limping worse now, its front prints dug deeper, the rear ones dragging more often. The second set of hoof prints, the rider from the north, had moved in close. At times they rode nearly parallel, and the scuffs in the dust told him there had been points where the two had slowed together. Not a meeting exactly, but close enough for the air between them to tighten. The rock walls on either side of the pass rose higher as he approached, their surfaces rough and split, dotted with tufts of dry grass and the occasional stubborn mesquite. From their tops, a man could see every movement below without being seen himself. He kept his eyes scanning the ridges, not lingering too long in one place. A fixed gaze could give away as much as a careless step. The wind here was strange, funneled through the cut in the rock. It carried scents and sounds with an edge they didn't have in the open basin. He could smell the faint musk of horses, sharper now, mixed with the dry tang of leather that had been heated under the sun. Once, he thought he heard the faint clink of metal, not enough to be certain, just a suggestion carried on the wind, gone as quickly as it came. The mare shifted under him, not nervous, but aware. Her steps shortened slightly, her hooves finding the quieter ground along the edge of the trail. He let her choose the line. A good horse could read danger in the earth faster than a man could see it. Halfway into the pass, the walls drew closer, and the light dimmed. The air felt cooler here, not from shade alone, but from the way the stone seemed to hold the night's breath. The sound of their passage changed too. The soft crush of dust gave way to a muted echo, every step of the mare's hooves bouncing off the stone and back again in a low, hollow note. The tracks ahead broke briefly at a patch of bare rock, but the dust picked them up again on the far side. Here, he noticed something different. The boot prints from the lead rider were more frequent, more erratic. In places, they veered slightly off the trail, as if the man had looked for something in the rock walls before returning to his horse. At the narrowest point of the pass, where the walls seemed to lean inward, the wind died almost completely. The silence there was so complete it felt heavy, like a weight pressing against his ears. Even the mare's breathing sounded too loud. Beyond that choke point, the trail began to open again, the light returning in full. He could see the path curling ahead into a small saddle between two rises. The hoofprints climbed toward it, steady but slow. The second set still shadowed close, patient, waiting for the right stretch of ground. He let the mare stop just shy of the opening, turning her slightly so he could look back the way they had come. The basin was far below now, the vultures still circling the carcass. From here, it looked like another world, flat, sun-bleached, and distant. But the feeling in his gut said the distance wasn't enough. Ahead lay the hills in full, steeper ground, tighter spaces, and fewer ways out than in. Once he crossed into them, the land would decide the terms. The saddle between the hills looked calm enough from a distance, but every step toward it felt heavier, as if the ground were thickening under the mare's hooves. The air here was still, without the faintest whisper of wind to carry sense or sound. Even the insects seemed absent, as though the land itself had told them to keep quiet. The hoofprints ahead were unchanged, the limping horse, the rider walking at times, and always that second set tracking alongside. But now there was something new. Faint, almost hidden in the loose dust along the trail's edge, was a third sign. It wasn't much, just the faint curve of a hoof, lighter than the others, as if the animal carrying it had been moving slower, keeping to softer ground to muffle its steps. Whoever it was, they were trailing from behind. He reined the mare in, letting her stand while he studied the sign. It was fresh. The edges of the prints still held their shape, the dust undisturbed by wind. If the rider ahead had passed here less than an hour ago, then this one had followed not long after, close enough that he might already be within sight if he had the high ground. The mare's ears twitched back, then forward again. She had caught something on the air, some sound too faint for him to hear. Her head lifted slightly, nostrils working, her body holding still in a way that told him this wasn't the restless pause of a tired animal. This was focus. He let her stand a moment longer before nudging her forward. There was no point in turning back. The pass behind him was a funnel, a place where he could be cornered too easily. Whatever followed would have to be faced in open ground. The trail climbed steadily toward the saddle, the earth underfoot dry and brittle, breaking under each hoofstep. Loose stones skittered down the slope in small cascades. Every sound seemed too loud here. Halfway up, he caught the first echo. It wasn't his. It was faint, distorted by the shape of the hills, but it was there. The rhythmic thud of hooves, far enough back that it came in broken beats. Whoever was behind him wasn't trying to hide anymore. He didn't look back yet. Looking back too soon could be as much an invitation as it was a warning. Instead, he kept the mare's pace steady, letting her carry them upward until the ground began to level beneath her hooves. At the crest of the saddle, he stopped. From here, the land dropped into a narrow valley, greener than the basin below, with a thin stream cutting through the center. Cottonwoods marked the water's course, their branches shifting in the faintest breeze. The hoofprints ahead angled toward them, the trail tightening where the valley floor narrowed. He turned in the saddle and looked back. There, far below, near the mouth of the pass, a rider sat still on a dark horse. The distance was too great to see his face, But the stillness of his posture said enough. He wasn't riding hard to catch up. He was watching, measuring, and that meant he wasn't in a hurry. The mare shifted under him, uneasy with the pause. He gave her a light squeeze with his knees, and they started down into the valley. The rider behind didn't move. For now. The slope carried him down into the green, the air cooling as the cottonwoods closed overhead. The stream ran thin but steady, its voice quiet against the hush of the valley. In the heat of the day, water and shade should have meant life, birdsong, the scrape of insects in the bark, the rustle of leaves stirred by creatures moving between shadows. But there was nothing. The stillness here was different from the silence of the open plains. Out there, the quiet was vast, stretched thin over miles of empty land. Here it was, close, heavy, like a blanket pressed too tightly over the mouth. Every sound he made, the mare's breathing, the soft creak of saddle leather, the faint jingle of her bit, felt sharper, like they were intruding on something that didn't want them here. The hoof prints ahead were easy to read in the damp soil along the water's edge. The limping horse had slowed even more, the depth of its front prints nearly twice that of the rear. The rider had dismounted again, his boot prints pressed deep beside the trail. At one point, the tracks broke from the stream, angling into a cluster of cottonwoods where the grass grew thick and high. The second set of prints, the rider from the north, followed with no deviation, staying just close enough that the leading man must have known he was there. Yet the spacing never changed. No rush, no chase, just a constant shadow. The mare's head lifted suddenly, her ears pricking forward, eyes locked on the trees ahead. He let her stand, scanning the brush. The cottonwoods were spaced just far enough apart to hide a horse and rider from certain angles. The leaves moved faintly, but not from wind. It was too light for that. He studied the ground again. In the softer earth beneath one tree, there was a patch where the hoofprints deepened sharply, as if the horse had stopped hard. Nearby, the boot prints milled in a tight circle before both horse and man moved on. It was a hesitation point. Whoever it was, they had stopped there to look back, or to wait. He eased the mare toward the stream, letting her drink. The cold water moved lazily over smooth stones, and the smell of wet earth rose up, cutting through the dry dust still clinging to his boots. But even as he let her rest, he kept one hand near the rifle. The longer he stood there, the more the stillness pressed in. It wasn't empty, it was expectant. Like the air was holding something just out of sight, waiting for him to step far enough in that turning back would no longer be an option. A vulture's shadow passed briefly overhead, sliding over the grass like a dark hand. It didn't linger, just moved on toward the ridges beyond the valley. He watched it go, knowing it was never wrong about where the day was headed. The trail ahead disappeared into thicker cover, where the cottonwoods grew closer together and the light dropped into a deep, mottled green. If he followed, the walls of the valley would press tighter, and the distance between the ridges would close until there was only one way forward and no room to turn. The mare raised her head from the water, ears forward again. She was ready to move. The question was whether the valley was ready for him. The mare stepped lightly as they left the open stretch of stream behind and moved into the close green of the valley's throat. The cottonwoods crowded together here, their trunks pale and scarred, their roots clutching at the damp banks as if holding the earth in place. The air felt heavier, thicker, and the filtered light turned the ground into a patchwork of shadow and pale gold. The trail followed the stream, winding between trees that seemed to lean inward. The water's voice was louder now, tumbling over small stones, but underneath it he caught another sound, a slow, irregular drip.
At first, he thought it was just water slipping from branch to branch, the last of the morning dew, falling into the current. But as he drew closer, the scent told him otherwise. The metallic tang that had haunted the wind since before dawn was here, fresh and sharp, laced with the sweetness of decay just beginning. They rounded a bend in the stream, and the source came into view. The water darkened where it spread wide between the banks, a slow stain curling into the current like smoke into still air. It wasn't much, not the rush of a large wound, but enough to tint the clear flow into something that caught the eye. On the far bank lay a horse, its body twisted awkwardly, one leg caught in the roots of a fallen tree. Its hide was slick with sweat and dust, the flank torn open in a way that spoke of teeth. The wound was deep, ragged, not from a blade, but from something that had gripped and shaken until the flesh gave way. Around the carcass, the mud was torn and churned. Hoof prints led in, but only boot prints led out. The rider had taken what he could. The saddle was gone, along with the bridle and packs, and left the animal where it fell. The boot prints didn't hurry. They walked downstream, keeping to the edge of the water where the ground was firmer. A few paces behind them, the second set of prints appeared again, the shadow that had been following all day. And now there was a third set. These were lighter, smaller, a horse walking without a rider, its steps erratic, sometimes crossing over the others before falling back again. Whoever had been trailing behind had closed the gap enough to meet the second rider here, and the three had moved on together. The water's slow swirl carried the stain downstream, breaking it into thin ribbons that caught on stones before sliding free again. The mare refused to drink, pulling her head back and stamping once in the shallow mud. Overhead, a vulture's shadow passed, then another, circling lower. The birds had followed him from the basin, patient and unhurried, as if they knew this day had more to give them. The trail ahead left the water and cut into the densest part of the valley's cover. The light there was dim, and the air carried no wind at all. It was the kind of place where sound died quickly, and where the first thing you saw might also be the last thing you did. He shifted the rifle in its scabbard and nudged the mare forward. The water whispered behind them, still carrying its stain toward places he hadn't yet seen. The valley tightened with every step, the cottonwoods pressing closer together until their trunks formed a pale, silent wall on either side. The ground turned from damp earth to hard-packed soil, stripped bare by hooves and boots. The air was close, stale in a way that made breathing feel like pulling water through cloth. The hoofprints and boot tracks ahead were crowded now, overlapping, weaving in and out of each other like a tangle of snakes. It was no longer the clean, separate lines he'd been reading since dawn. This was where paths had met, and where they'd slowed. He guided the mare forward with the care of a man stepping into a room where he didn't know who was waiting. Her ears flicked back and forth, the muscles under the saddle shifting like coiled rope. She knew it too. The first sign came not in sight, but in sound. The faint chime of metal striking metal, sharp and quick, swallowed almost instantly by the thick air. A stirrup brushing against another. A spur catching on stone. Close. The valley floor widened briefly, forming a shallow bowl between the hills. The ground here was trampled, churned into dust so fine it clung to the air in lazy spirals. The hoofprints stopped crisscrossing and began to form tight circles, the kind that came from riders keeping motion without leaving. And then the wind, what little of it existed here, shifted just enough to bring him the unmistakable smell of sweat, leather, and the faint tang of oil on steel. Not the worn scent of a saddle in motion, but the sharper, cleaner smell of a weapon that had been kept ready. He eased the mare to the side,
keeping her hooves on the harder ground near the bank where the sound wouldn't carry as far. The dust here told a newer story, the wide, fresh arcs of horses turning to face the path he now rode. He saw them before they made any move to hide. Two riders, just ahead in the bowl, their horses standing still and dark against the pale dust. The first was the one from the north, the shadow that had been closing all day. The second was unknown, heavier in the saddle, his mount fresh, unburdened. Both sat square, watching. The air seemed to pause between them. The only movement was the slow drift of dust between the horse's legs, the sun filtering through it in thin gold threads. He didn't draw his rifle. Not yet. His hand rested near it, loose but ready, as the mare shifted her weight beneath him. Then, from the trees on the far side of the bowl, a third figure stepped out. Not mounted. Boots sinking into the dust, gait steady, shoulders square. The one he'd been following since before sunrise. He was close enough now to see the worn edges of the man's coat, the dark stains on the cuffs, the weight he carried slung low in his left hand. Not a weapon. Something wrapped in canvas, heavy enough to pull his shoulder down. No one spoke. There was no need. The air between them was already set. Steel was near, and dust was waiting to rise. The man on foot stopped in the center of the bowl, set the canvas-wrapped thing down in the dirt, and straightened slowly. His eyes never left him. The riders flanking him shifted slightly in their saddles, the horses' ears tilting forward like they'd been trained to hear the same silent cue. The valley had gone from stillness to readiness, the kind that came just before movement, the thin, breathless moment where the first man decides if he'll reach for his weapon or walk away. And here, in the throat of this land, walking away had never really been an option. The stillness shattered in the smallest of ways. It wasn't a yell or a gunshot, not yet. It was the sharp, deliberate scrape of a boot shifting in the dust, the kind of sound a man makes when he decides the waiting's over. The man on foot moved first. His right hand came up, not toward the canvas-wrapped bundle at his side, but toward the dark shape at his belt. The riders flanking him straightened in their saddles, their horses stepping forward in unison, dust kicking up around their hooves. He didn't wait to see what they'd pull. His hand dropped to the rifle, the motion smooth, drilled into him over years of knowing there was no prize for being second. The leather strap slid off the stock, the barrel came up, and his finger found the trigger without thought. The first shot cracked through the valley, the sound echoing against the stone walls like thunder in a canyon. One of the mounted men jerked sideways, his hat flying as his body listed hard against the saddle horn. The horse shied, hooves tearing at the earth, before bolting toward the trees with its rider half slumped and barely holding on. The other rider didn't break. He spurred forward, the horse lunging, closing the space fast. Steel flashed in his hand, not a pistol, but a short, curved blade meant for close work. The dust rose in a thick, choking cloud as the hooves hammered closer. The man on foot had already drawn his revolver. The shine of its barrel caught the light for a split second before he fired, the report dull compared to the crack of the rifle. The bullet struck stone near the mare's flank, fragments of rock biting into her hide. She jumped sideways, but he held her seat, swinging the rifle's barrel toward the man on the charging horse. He fired again. This time, the shot hit true. The rider jerked, the blade slipping from his fingers before he tumbled sideways, hitting the ground in a heavy roll. The horse kept running, riderless, vanishing into the cottonwoods. The dust was thicker now, curling upward in pale, slow spirals that blurred the edges of sight. In the haze, the man on foot was moving, slow but deliberate, toward the canvas bundle he'd set down moments before. His revolver stayed in his hand, the barrel low but ready. The mare's breathing was hard under him, her ears locked forward, her muscles taut. She was ready to run, ready to fight, ready for whichever way this would break. And then the man on foot stopped, looking at him through the dust. Not at the rifle, not at the horse. At him. Something about the stillness in that look made the air heavier. This wasn't done. The first man had fallen, but the day wasn't finished taking its toll. Not yet. The dust hadn't even settled when the man on foot broke for the cottonwoods. He didn't run wildly. There was purpose in his stride, a straight line toward the darker cover where the valley narrowed again. The revolver stayed in his hand, low but ready, his head turning just enough to keep one eye on the space behind him. He wasn't fleeing in panic. He was moving to a place where the land would give him the advantage. The mare felt the shift before he even asked for it. She surged forward, hooves digging into the soft dirt, the rhythm of her gait pounding through his legs and into the stock of the rifle still in his hands. The ground between them closed fast. Each stride sent a puff of dust curling in the air, hanging long enough to blur the edges of the man's shape. He hit the tree line ahead of her and vanished into the mottled green and shadow. The cottonwoods were dense here, their roots curling over the banks of the stream, turning the ground uneven. The mare adjusted her pace, shorter steps now, careful over the slick stones and sudden dips. Every splash into the shallow water sent ripples racing away, each one marking their position as surely as hoofprints in the dust. Through the shifting trunks, he caught flickers of the man ahead, a shoulder passing between two trees, the quick gleam of steel, the dark arc of his coat as he cut sharply left. And then there was another sound. Hooves. Behind. They were lighter, faster, not the slow stalk he'd felt in the morning, but a flat-out run. The shadow rider from before had come alive, driving his horse hard into the chase. The beat of its stride was sharp and even, closing distance faster than the man on foot could put it behind him. He had no choice but to push the mare harder, weaving between the cottonwoods, ducking under low branches, keeping just enough speed to hold his place between hunter and hunted. The stream curved, the banks rising higher, and the sound of water deepened as they neared a rocky drop. The man ahead scrambled up the right bank, boots slipping in the damp soil before finding hold on the roots. He climbed fast, dragging the canvas bundle after him, its weight pulling against his balance. The shadow rider behind didn't slow for the stream. His horse plunged through, the splash echoing against the stone walls of the narrowing channel. The gap between them was closing, the rhythm of pursuit quickening. The mare's breathing grew harsh, each exhale pushing hot against his legs. He felt the quiver in her shoulders, not fear, but the strain of speed in rough ground. She was game, but even the best mount had its limits. The man on foot reached the top of the bank, staggered once, then kept moving, disappearing over the crest. He pushed the mare after him, her hooves tearing at the slope, sending loose earth and stones sliding back toward the water. She crested the top with a surge, her stride stretching into the open ground beyond. And there, across the rise, was the chase laid out in full. The man on foot running hard over the open flat, the shadow rider closing in from behind, his horse eating the distance with every bound. The air shimmered over the pale earth, and the sun was high enough now to make the whole scene burn at the edges. One of them would break first. The question was who? The open ground ended as abruptly as a slammed door. The man on foot reached a break in the ridgeline ahead, a jagged mouth of rock where the earth had split and fallen inward. Without hesitation, he vanished into it, swallowed by the dark cut between the walls. The shadow rider followed, lowering in his saddle as his horse plunged into the narrow pass, dust curling high behind them. He reined the mare in for half a breath at the canyon's edge. The gap ahead was a ribbon of shadow winding between stone walls that rose straight and high, their surfaces sunburnt red and streaked with black where water once ran. The air was cooler here, but it didn't feel clean. It carried the hollow echo of movement, hooves striking rock, the scrape of boot soles against loose stone, and beneath it, the faint ring of metal against metal. The mare stepped forward, her pace slowing to match the confines of the space. Every sound here doubled back on itself, the walls throwing it into the air until it was impossible to tell how close it really was. The canyon floor was uneven, a mix of hardpan, scattered boulders, and patches of loose shale that shifted treacherously underfoot. The prints ahead were clear in the dustier stretches. The man on foot kept his stride steady, though the drag of the canvas bundle left a furrow alongside his tracks. The shadow rider's horse left sharper, deeper impressions, its gait unbroken, still pressing forward without losing ground. The walls closed tighter, their height blotting out much of the sun. Strips of light fell in sharp angles, catching the edges of rocks and the dust in the air. Somewhere ahead, a raven croaked once, its voice bouncing between the walls before fading into the same heavy silence. The mare's ears flicked back. Behind them, faint but distinct, another sound joined the canyon's chorus, the clatter of stone shifting under weight. Too deliberate to be an animal, too light to be a falling rock. Someone was matching his pace in the high ledges above. He kept his eyes forward, but every instinct told him the canyon was no longer just a trail, it was a trap. This was the kind of ground where a man could be funneled into the kill, with no space to turn and no cover to hide behind. The sound ahead grew louder now, the quickened thud of boots on stone. The man on foot was running harder, the drag mark from the bundle cutting deeper into the dust. The shadow rider's horse thundered after him, its pace quickening in the narrowing space. The canyon bent sharply to the left, hiding whatever lay beyond. The walls here were close enough to scrape a shoulder against if he shifted in the saddle. The light dropped again, the air cooler still. And then came the first break in the noise, a hollow gap where the hoofbeats ahead stopped for the span of 2 heartbeats before starting again. A pause, a turn, or a decision. The pause in the canyon ahead was brief, but it was enough to change the air. It thickened, the way heat thickens before a storm, and the sound of pursuit seemed to pull inward, coiling tight. He urged the mare forward, slow and steady, her hooves testing each patch of ground. The bend in the canyon came quick, the left wall sweeping close enough that his boot nearly brushed the stone. The shadow on the other side was deep, swallowing the light until it seemed to take on weight. Then the canyon opened into a pocket of space, a sudden clearing ringed on all sides by walls too high to climb. The floor was a wide oval of dust and scattered rock, the kind of place a man found only by chance, or by design. The man on foot was there, standing near the far wall. The canvas bundle lay at his feet, the weight of it making a shallow depression in the dust. His revolver was in his hand, arm low, but his posture was tight, coiled. He wasn't winded, not enough for the miles he'd covered, which meant he'd been pacing himself for this. The shadow rider was there too, his horse circling slow, its nostrils flaring in the cooler air. Dust clung to its flanks, sweat darkening the hide in streaks. The rider's hand rested on the butt of his pistol, his gaze flicking between the man on foot and the newcomer riding in. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The walls of the canyon held the moment like a bowl holds water. No wind, no bird, just the muffled sound of horses breathing, the creak of leather, and the faint crackle of grit shifting under boots. The man on foot looked up first, his eyes locking on him. There was nothing in them that asked for help, only a calculation, as if he were another piece of the board to be moved. His free hand tapped the bundle lightly, a gesture without urgency but full of meaning. Whatever was in it was the reason for the day's long trail. Whatever was in it had pulled every track together into this one place. The shadow rider shifted in his saddle. The motion was small, but it made the mare's ears flick back, sensing the ripple of intent. His hand slid the pistol clear of its holster, the faint scrape of metal against leather loud in the still air. That was the moment the coil snapped. The man on foot moved first, not toward cover, but toward the bundle, swinging it up in one motion. The shadow rider's pistol came up, the barrel locking in, and the muzzle flash bloomed sharp in the dim light. The report cracked against the canyon walls, rolling back in waves. The man on foot staggered but didn't fall. He swung the bundle hard, and something inside it struck the ground with a heavy, metallic thud. The dust in the clearing erupted into motion, hooves pounding, boots sliding, stones scattering under sudden weight. This wasn't the chase anymore. This was where the day decided who left the canyon standing. The sound in the canyon rose all at once. Gunfire, hooves, the deep bark of boots grinding into dust, then collapsed into the flat, ringing quiet that follows violence. The mare stood tense beneath him, sides heaving, her ears darting back and forth for sounds that no longer came. The air was thick with powder smoke, hanging low, refusing to rise. Every breath tasted of it, acrid and metallic, clinging to the tongue like a warning that lingered even after the danger had passed. The shadow rider's horse stood riderless near the wall, reins dangling, its flanks streaked with dust and sweat. The man himself lay half-sprawled in the dirt, one arm twisted awkwardly under him, the black of his coat blending with the shadow pooled at the base of the stone. A dark stain spread slowly from beneath his side, soaking into the pale dust until it looked like the ground itself was bleeding. The man on foot was still standing, barely. His right arm hung limp, his revolver somewhere in the dirt behind him. The canvas bundle was at his feet again, its weight pulling the fabric into hard lines over whatever it held. He was breathing heavy now, each inhale shallow, his chest rising and falling like a man who'd been running for days and finally stopped. The silence was heavy. Even the mare seemed unwilling to break it. He swung down from the saddle, boots sinking into the soft dust of the clearing. His steps were slow, each one measured, his eyes never leaving the man by the bundle. There was no sudden rush now, no desperate movement. Whatever had been fought over was decided, but the meaning of it hadn't yet shown itself. The man on foot watched him approach, his eyes sharp despite the blood matting the side of his coat. He didn't reach for the bundle. He didn't need to. That small tap earlier, before the first shot, had already told him everything. He crouched beside it, feeling the weight through the canvas. Solid, dense, edges that were too clean to be natural. He pulled the fabric back just far enough to see the dull gleam beneath. Metal, shaped by hand, heavy with purpose. A lockbox. Its corners were battered, one hinge bent, the surface scuffed by travel, but the clasp was still in place. There was no key in sight. He looked up, but the man on foot had turned away, his gaze fixed on the canyon mouth. Not in fear, but in the watchful way a man does when he knows a thing isn't over, only paused. The vultures had found them. They wheeled in the blue strip of sky above, shadows passing over the clearing in slow, deliberate arcs.
They didn't care about the lockbox or what it held. They only cared that the day had given them reason to wait. When he straightened, the dust shifted under his boots, settling into the first stillness since he'd entered this place. The chase was done. But the reason for it, the weight inside that box, would carry its own trail, and trails had a way of finding men again. Somewhere beyond the canyon, the wind picked up. It would scatter the dust, blur the tracks, and smooth the earth as if nothing had happened here. But the land remembered. And so would he. The canyon spat him out into open land, as if eager to be rid of him. The sun hit full on, bright enough to wash the world in pale gold and burn the shapes of the high walls into the backs of his eyes. The mare's stride slowed, her hooves finding easier ground now that the stone and shadow were behind them. Behind him, the silence of the canyon was complete. No hoofbeats, no shifting of stone. Only the weight of what he carried, not in his hands, but in the memory of how it had been earned. The lockbox rode in the saddlebag, its solid weight shifting with the mare's movement. It was small enough to be forgotten by the eye, but never by the body carrying it. Every step made it press against the leather, a reminder that the fight had been for more than the air in his lungs. The land ahead stretched wide and flat, the horizon shimmering with heat. Somewhere out there were towns, ranches, and the thin, wavering lines of telegraph wires. But for now, there was only the empty sweep of grass and dust, and the faint dark shape of the vulture line moving east with him. The sun's heat pulled sweat from his back and dust from the ground, and the mare's breathing settled into a slow, steady rhythm. The miles stretched without markers, but the shadows from the clouds overhead told the time better than any clock could. He thought of the man on foot, the one who had set the whole day in motion. By the time he'd ridden clear of the canyon, the man was sitting against the stone, his face turned toward the light at the mouth, his left hand resting on his wounded side. There had been no plea, no offer, and no farewell. Just a nod, the kind men give when there's nothing left to share but the fact of being alive. The box had been left without words, as if it was never his to keep, only to carry. And carry it he would, because there was nothing else to do. The West was full of things that didn't belong to the men who held them, and the line between possession and survival was thin as thread. The wind rose as the afternoon lengthened, brushing through the grass in long, slow waves. It cooled the sweat on his skin, but it also carried a low hum, not from nature, but from far-off metal. A telegraph line, singing quietly to itself in the distance. That sound had become the heartbeat of the frontier, carrying news, lies, and trouble faster than a man could ride. Somewhere ahead, the line would cross his trail, and somewhere along it would be men who had been waiting all day to learn whether the box reached them or not. The thought didn't bring dread, just the understanding that the day wasn't over and might not be for some time. Out here, survival wasn't counted in hours or even in miles. It was counted in how long you could keep moving with the weight you carried, whether it was in your hands, your saddle, or your head. The mare kept her pace, steady and sure. The vultures followed, their patience unbroken. And the land, as it always did, swallowed the day whole and waited for the next one to come. The sun was low now, bleeding into the horizon in a slow spill of copper and gold. The land stretched endless in every direction, the shadows of the grasslands leaning long toward the east. The mare's ears flicked lazily with each shift of the wind, her gait easing into the unhurried pace of an animal that knew the work of the day was nearly done. He didn't push her. There was no reason. Whatever waited ahead could wait a little longer, and whatever followed had fallen silent behind him. The lockbox shifted in the saddlebag with each step, a small, muted thud against the leather. Its weight had not lessened, but it had become part of the ride, as steady as the creak of the saddle or the rhythmic sway of the mare's shoulders. The air cooled as the sun dropped, carrying the faint scent of water from somewhere unseen. A few dark shapes cut across the sky, wings outstretched, hawks this time, not vultures. They rode the thermals higher, scanning the earth below for movement, their cries sharp against the quiet. He watched the horizon, where the last strip of sun was slipping behind a distant rise. The light there was blinding, a molten edge that burned the eyes if you stared too long. It painted the mare's mane in fire, turned the dust at her hooves into a cloud of glowing embers that drifted up and vanished. For a moment, it almost looked like the day would end clean, the kind of ending where the ride simply stopped and the world folded into night. But the West rarely gave clean endings. As the last of the light thinned, he caught sight of a shape against the horizon, still, narrow, and sharp enough to be a man on horseback. The distance made it impossible to tell whether it was moving toward him or waiting. The sun flared one last time before dropping away, and in that flash of gold, the figure seemed to turn, as if it had been watching all along. The darkness came fast after that. The colors bled out of the land, leaving it washed in silver from the rising moon. The air cooled further, and the sounds of night began to replace the day. The soft trill of insects, the low rustle of wind through dry brass. He kept riding, not faster, not slower. The shape on the horizon was gone now, swallowed by the dark. Maybe it had never been there at all. The mare's steady breathing, the weight of the lockbox, the endless stretch of land ahead, they were all that remained certain. And somewhere in the quiet between hoofbeats, the truth settled in. A day in the life of a cowboy wasn't about the ride, the fight, or even the trail. It was about carrying what you could, as far as you could, until the land decided to take it from you. The last light was gone. The night had claimed the West again. And he kept riding. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.